At around 4 p.m. on May 20th, 1936, Tokyo police finally put an end to what was one of the most intense manhunts that Japan's bustling capital city had seen to date. For the past 3 days, the Tokyo police force had scoured the city in search of a criminal who had left behind a crime scene that even the most seasoned detective could never forget. Inside a love hotel in Tokyo's Ogumachi area, they discovered the body of 42-year-old restaurant owner Ishida Kichiso. He had the pink sash of a kimono wrapped tightly around his neck. But the part that stood out the most was what was going on between his legs. Because something was missing. His manhood, which had been completely severed from the body. It was a crime scene that was uniquely grotesque. A crime scene that stood in connection to a case that would only become more unique and more morbidly fascinating as more details came to light. Because soon it became clear that the man that the police were looking for, well, wasn't a man. The culprit was a young woman. A former geisha turned prostitute who, during her arrest 3 days after committing the crime, was still casually carrying around her victim's severed genitals inside her kimono, almost as if it was some sort of twisted souvenir of her disturbing crime. So, who exactly was this unassuming-looking young woman? How did she turn from an aspiring geisha, a symbol of Japanese elegance and beauty, into one of the most infamous and one of the most talked about criminals in early 20th century Japan? And most important of all, why the hell did she decide to take away this poor man's Johnston? Well, let's dive into a tale that goes beyond just a shocking crime. A story of a deeply complex woman who, through one of Japan's most widely publicized and downright bizarre criminal cases, evolved from a symbol of female deviancy into an unexpected icon of sexual liberation in the land of the rising sun. This is the story of Abe Sada, the killer geisha. In May of 1905, the Abe family welcomed their newest member, a girl named Sada. Sada was the youngest of a total of 8 children, though only 4 of them, including Sada herself, would survive until adulthood. As for Sada's parents, they were well-known, well-respected tatami mat makers, and they were also on the wealthier side, and consequently were in a position to provide their children with a pretty comfortable upbringing. Sada in particular was doted on by her mother, who encouraged her to learn singing, dancing, and playing the shamisen, a traditional Japanese instrument, from a very young age. And Sada seemed to greatly enjoy these activities, often skipping formal education to devote even more time to her practice. Her mother supported this, sending her to lessons in a new, elegant kimono and fancy makeup every single day, in hopes of sending her daughter down a path that closely aligned with that of a geisha. The highly skilled and highly respected female entertainers that represented the beauty and the elegance of Japanese traditional culture. Early on, it seemed as if Sada, who greatly enjoyed learning the skills of a geisha, had a dream. A dream of becoming one of these beautifully dressed, admired figures herself. But despite her mother's encouragement and the privileges of her upbringing, her early life was far from ideal. She did not speak until the age of 4, and as family conflicts surrounding 2 of her siblings started to consume her parents' attention, she became increasingly isolated and lonely. By the age of 14, this loneliness pushed her closer and closer towards a group of delinquents, fueling a rebellious streak that only grew stronger over time. According to one of the Abe family's neighbors, it was around this time that Sada began to develop a bossy personality. And she would also begin to openly defy her parents' wishes by voluntarily dropping out of school at the young age of 15. But the traumatic event that would forever change the course of her life came when, still just 15 years old, she was raped by a student from Keio University who was staying in her neighborhood. It was a devastating experience that had a profound impact on her already fragile mental state. Reflecting on the incident decades later, she stated, quote, "I realized I would never get married, and I was so worried about what to do that I became desperate." From that point on, Sada's behavior spiraled further and further. She began stealing large sums of money, up to 600,000 yen in today's value, from her family home, using it to fund nights out with her delinquent friends. She slept until noon, spent her days drinking, partying, dating several men, and rarely returning home before late at night. While her parents had initially hoped that she would simply grow out of this phase, at some point they had completely lost faith in their young daughter's ability to change for the better. And so in 1922, when she was still just 17 years old, Sada's father sold her to a geisha house located in Yokohama called Hajimino. At first glance, this seemed like an opportunity for her to turn her life around and fulfill her childhood dream of becoming a geisha. And according to her oldest sister, Sada did willingly choose this path. Sada herself, on the other hand, later refuted this, claiming that her father had actually sent her there as punishment for her promiscuity. But regardless of whose decision it was, Sada signed the contract and entered the geisha world under the stage name Miyako. Unfortunately, she struggled in what was an incredibly demanding and incredibly competitive profession. Because though she was undoubtedly very skilled at playing the shamisen, she lacked the refined social and performance skills expected of a geisha. After all, a true geisha was not merely an entertainer, but also an educated conversationalist who, with some rare exceptions, was actually not expected to engage in sexual acts with the client. However, as more and more customers began demanding such services from Sada specifically, her establishment allowed it, and even forced her to comply. And so, for the next 5 years, Sada lived in a sort of limbo between working as a low-ranking geisha and outright prostitution. She changed establishments multiple times. She moved from Yokohama to Toyama, then to Nagano. But with each relocation, her circumstances worsened, with acquaintance-turned-pimp Inaba Masatake deceiving her into signing contracts that buried her in ever-increasing amounts of debt. At one point, she finally had enough. She abandoned her geisha aspirations and fully embraced life as a prostitute. A field of work that for her would remain pretty much the same, just with significantly better pay. And so, in 1927, with her father as a co-signer, she signed a contract with a high-class brothel in Osaka's Tobita district. She actually became quite popular among customers, but deep down, she was still miserable. After about a year, she ran away, and for the next 7 years made multiple attempts to leave the profession for good. But the money always reeled her back in. Fast forward to 1935, when following an arrest for unlicensed prostitution and a failed romance, Sada finally found some work as a maid at a restaurant, where she met a man named Omiya Goro. This guy, he was different. Politically ambitious and determined, Omiya saw potential in the troubled Sada, and after listening to her tragic story, made it his mission to steer her life in a better direction. Unlike anyone she had ever encountered before, Omiya genuinely wanted to help her, and as fate would have it, their meeting set off a chain of events that changed everything. Though not necessarily for the better. You see, Omiya had big plans for Abe Sada, envisioning her running her own restaurant in the future. But before that could happen, she needed a bit of stability. Stability that would only come by starting with a proper job. And with Omiya's help, she found just that at a restaurant in Tokyo's Nakano neighborhood. Yoshidaya was a successful two-story establishment owned and run by a married couple. Or actually, it was the wife who managed most of the business. Her 42-year-old husband, Ishida Kichiso, this guy was way too busy being a creep and a womanizer, and when Sada began working there, Ishida's flirtatious nature quickly took hold once more. In a way, the two were a perfect match. Keep in mind that at the time, Sada herself was still romantically involved with Omiya Goro. You know, the guy who had secured her the job at Yoshidaya in the first place. But once Ishida made his advances, she found herself completely unable to resist his charm. The two began an affair, with Ishida sneaking away on business trips that conveniently overlapped with Sada's own absences from work. In reality, the two started engaging in steamy, love-making marathons that could only be described as legendary. Their secret rendezvous would stretch on for days at a time, with little to no breaks in between. And as the relationship evolved and became more intense, so did their bedroom activities. At some point, a regular old sex was simply not cutting it anymore. And so, by using the sash of her kimono, Sada brought the act of strangulation and asphyxiation into the mix to heighten their pleasure. Freaky stuff. They would continue to engage in these secret love-making sessions undisturbed for around 2 months, until Ishida's wife found out. But of course, neither Sada nor Ishida were willing to stop at this point. Their passion was simply too intoxicating, their chemistry in bed too good. Which is why in late April of 1936, the two decided to run away together. For the following weeks, the two moved from one establishment to another, from Shibuya to Futako Tamagawa, before finally arriving at a love hotel in Ogomachi on May 11th, 1936. It would be their final destination as a couple. For the next 7 days, their passionate encounters continued, strangulation still playing a vital role in their sex play. But something felt different. One night, Sada held a knife close to Ishida's private parts and joked around that she would make sure he never played around with another woman ever again. Ishida laughed it off, completely unaware at the time that she might actually be serious. Because while the intercourse was undoubtedly as freaky as ever, the two had drifted apart in terms of personal feelings. In short, Sada had fallen in love with Ishida. I mean, she was completely enamored with the guy, to a point where the mere thought of sharing him with anyone else became flat out unbearable. Well, unfortunately, that is exactly what Ishida wanted. Between one of their countless lovemaking sessions, Ishida suggested that he should probably return home to his wife and children for a while, but that Sada should remain as his mistress. A proposal that will cost him his life, and of course, his dearest body part. At around 2 a.m. on May 18th, 1936, Ishida, completely exhausted and suffering from insomnia, had taken an excessive dose of a sleeping medicine called calmotine. He was in a deep sleep, the perfect opportunity for Sada to act. Driven by jealousy and desperation, she wrapped the pink sash of her kimono around his neck once more. But this time, it wasn't for pleasure. Before noticing that Sada was not just being a freak in the sheets as usual, Ishida was drawing his final breaths, and within minutes, he was dead. Of course, Sada wasn't done yet. Taking out a knife, she severed his genitalia, and I mean the whole entire apparatus, and wrapped them into a piece of paper, the torn-off cover of the magazine Fuji, according to Sada's own testimony. Then, using Ishida's blood, there was quite a lot of it as you can imagine, she wrote a message on the bedsheets. Sada, Kichi, futari kiri. Sada and Kichi, just the two of us. She then carved the same phrase into his left thigh and etched a character for her name, Sada, into his left arm, before laying beside his mutilated body for the next couple of hours. Only when the following morning had arrived did she gather her lover's severed phallus, put on his underwear. She later stated she liked the smell of it, and then left the hotel at around 8 a.m., casually telling the staff that she was going out to buy some confections and that her companion was still sleeping and wished to not be disturbed. It wasn't until 2:30 p.m., when Sada had still not returned, that the hotel staff grew kinda suspicious. So they entered the room, only to discover a scene that none of them would ever forget. Ishida Kichizo's lifeless body laying on the bed, Sada's haunting message carved into his thigh, his Johnston completely missing. The police was called in to secure the crime scene, and a citywide manhunt for Abe Sada had officially begun. Catching Sada, however, was easier said than done. She had checked into the hotel under the name Tanaka Kayo, an alias that she had been using for a while. This left the police with little more than this old photograph of their suspect to go on, a photograph which they quickly began circulating. The following morning, the media had already picked up on what would become the biggest news story in Japan that year, which is pretty wild when considering that 1936 had started with an attempted military coup just 3 months earlier. The face of the yet unidentified woman was plastered across the front pages of every major newspaper in Tokyo, as a wave of alleged sightings of Sada started to flood in. There was one false sighting in Tokyo's bustling Ginza district that drew such an enormous crowd that the authorities actually had to close off an entire road. Overnight, Abe Sada had become Japan's most wanted. And yet, while an entire capital city and its police force scoured Tokyo for her, she simply enjoyed a couple of days off, always accompanied by her dead lover's severed meat, which she kept inside her kimono, close to her body. She spent the following 2 days shopping and even went to see a movie. She met with Omiya and cried her eyes out, made plans to go to Osaka to end her own life, and on the night of May 19th, she checked into an inn in Shinagawa Ward where she indulged in a bath and a massage, and while having a beer composed several farewell letters, one to her deceased lover and others to various acquaintances. Oh, and it was also at the Shinagawa Inn that, according to her later testimony, she attempted to use the body part that she had severed from Ishida's body, albeit without much success, unsurprisingly. Sada's escape didn't come to an end until May 20th, when at around 4 p.m., a detective scanning the inn's registry noticed something peculiar. One guest had checked in under the name Owada Nao, Nao being a gender-neutral name, which raised his suspicion. Just to make sure, he knocked on the door, and sure enough, there she was. The woman that the entirety of Tokyo had been looking for the past few days. Sada made no attempt to flee and remained shockingly composed, so much so that even the detective who had discovered her whereabouts couldn't believe that he had actually found the culprit he was looking for, until Sada readily presented Ishida's severed member as proof of her identity. Much like her crime and escape from the crime scene, Sada's arrest once again dominated the headlines. But even in the photos of her arrest, she still really didn't appear as a ruthless killer. Instead, clad in a refined kimono and wearing a gentle smile, she looked more like a demure, elegant woman. In one of the photos, she even appears to be cracking jokes with the policemen surrounding her. And it is this peculiar contrast between her composed demeanor and the unspeakably gruesome nature of her crime that only adds to the case's bizarre allure. And the more details that emerged, the stranger it became. Largely thanks to Sada's own candid and extensive testimony. During 8 lengthy interrogation sessions, Sada answered all questions with remarkable eloquence and detail. She recounted the events of the fateful night, her relationship with Ishida Kichizo, their highly experimental sexual escapades, and heaped praise upon Ishida's performance in bed. Quote, It is hard to say exactly what was so good about Ishida, but it was impossible to say anything bad about his looks, his attitude, his skill as a lover, the way he expressed his feelings. I had never met such a sexy man. Ishida was very skilled in bed. When it came to sex, he understood a woman's feelings. He was very patient and did a lot to give pleasure. Now, one of the things that the interrogators really wanted to know, and honestly this would have been my first question, was why the hell she cut off her dead lover's thing. Her response was pretty straightforward. Because I couldn't take his head or body with me. I wanted to take the part of him that brought back to me the most vivid memories. They were the dearest and most important part of him. His wife would have touched it when she washed the body, and I didn't want anybody else touching it. In any event, I had to flee from that place. But if I had Ishida's penis, I thought I wouldn't get lonely. It would be as though he were with me. You know what? In a very sick, disturbing, twisted kind of way, it kinda does make sense. And as weird as it sounds, I totally believe Sada when she says that she was in love with Ishida. It's just that unfortunately to her, killing him was also the best way of making sure that no one else could love him ever again. Quote, "I loved him so much. I wanted him all to myself. But since we were not husband and wife, as long as he lived, he could be embraced by other women. I knew that if I killed him, no other woman could ever touch him again. So I killed him." Beyond her personal emotions, the interrogators also delved into Sada's physical health and psychological state. They sought to understand her insatiable desires and her possessive mindset that, in their mind, led her to murder Ishida. This got to a point where she became less of a criminal and more of a specimen to be studied. A representation of the kind of quote-unquote sexually deviant woman that in the 1930s, during an era where Japan was dominated by extreme right-wing nationalism and strict conservatism, was seen as a big threat to society. As for the media, they jumped onto her story, labeling her the Showa era's dokusu, or poison woman. Later, the term Sadaism emerged, used to describe similar crimes committed by other women. And even more astonishingly, the transcripts of her police interrogations became a national bestseller in 1936. Sada mania had truly swept through the Empire of Japan, providing its citizens with an oddly captivating distraction from the nation's growing political unrest. But as enthralling as the case was, justice had to be served at some point. And so, 7 months after Ishida Kichiso's brutal murder, following months of interrogations, and nearly a month of court proceedings that gathered massive crowds of people eager to attend, Abe Sada finally received her sentence on December 21st, 1936. She was convicted of murder and mutilation of a corpse, but received a surprisingly light sentence. Just 6 years in prison, including the 7 months she had already served. In the end, she didn't even serve the full term, as she was released exactly 5 years after her crime on May 17th, 1941. Upon her release, Sada attempted to distance herself from her past as a poisoned woman. With the help of the authorities, she assumed a new identity, moving first to Ibaraki and then settling in Saitama Prefecture. And wouldn't you know it, she actually managed to get married for the first time in her life. To a businessman who had absolutely no clue that his wife had once been Japan's most infamous murderess. But of course, her true identity was destined to be revealed, sooner or later. You see, during World War II, interest in her case had faded. There were obviously more pressing issues in Japan at the time. But after the war, a resurgence of lurid interest brought her story back into the spotlight. Erotic pulp books based on her story, known as Osada books, flew off the shelves, thrusting her name back into the public eye. And with her past once again exposed, it was only a matter of time before Sada's husband learned the truth and disappeared from her life forever. Realizing that she could never escape her infamous reputation, Sada instead decided to embrace it. And surprisingly, over time, public perception of her shifted into a completely different direction. Whereas before the war, Sada had been presented as a cautionary tale, a woman consumed by sexual depravity, the post-war era saw her rebranded as a symbol of sexual freedom and love. For example, the renowned writer Sakaguchi Ango, after conducting an interview with Sada, described her as a tender, warm figure of salvation for future generations. Regarding her crime, he had this to say, quote, "This was not a crime. For her to cut off his member as a keepsake was the ultimate feminine act." Whether or not you want to agree with Sakaguchi's idea that carrying around a deceased man's shriveled up wiener is the pinnacle of femininity, he was far from the only person who met Abe Sada over the years who described her as being an exceptionally calm and kind person. And on a similar note, movies like 1976's In the Realm of the Senses, which were based on Sada's infamous crime, proved that he also wasn't the only one who saw her as a symbol of female passion and desire. Now, despite her dark past, Sada actually lived a relatively normal, quiet life in her later years. She got a job as a well-paid waitress, worked diligently, and in 1958 was even recognized by the Tokyo Restaurant Association as an outstanding employee. She then opened her own, well-received onigiri shop and bar in 1967, where she mingled with high-profile guests, including sumo wrestlers and stable masters, politicians, and entertainers, like the famous choreographer Hichikata Tatsumi, a longtime admirer of Abe Sada who in 1969 took this photo together with the former poisoned woman. That same year, she then also appeared in a film titled History of Bizarre Female Crimes in the Meiji, Taisho, and Showa periods, where she gives a brief interview on the side of the street. Both this film and her photo with Hichikata would later prove to hold immense significance in connection to the story of Abe Sada, being the last known photograph and the only video footage of Abe Sada to ever exist. Because less than 2 years later, in 1971, the 65-year-old just vanished. It was in June of 1971 that Sada left behind a note stating that she was seeking treatment for her rheumatism and intended to return in a month or two. But she never did, and the note she left behind ended with a pretty enigmatic final sentence reading, quote, "Shosen, I'm a useless woman." Abe Sada was never seen again. Probably. Despite Sada's success in turning her life around starting in the 1950s, there is reason to believe that she never truly found happiness. On several occasions, especially following the deaths of those close to her, she contemplated ending her own life, and it's possible that Sada simply chose to leave her shop and the people she knew behind to do just that. You know, seek an end to her troubled life away from the public eye. On the other hand, there are multiple theories and even alleged sightings suggesting that Sada may have remained alive as late as the early 1990s. Some believe she became a nun in the mid-1970s. Others claim she lived in hiding at an inn located in Asakusa until 1980, before disappearing once more. Then there was also the eternal memorial service held at Kuonji Temple in honor of Ishida Kichiso, arranged by Sada all the way back in 1955. It is said that an anonymous person continued to send flowers to honor Ishida every single year, even after Sada's disappearance in 1971. The flower deliveries stopped only in 1987, which raises the possibility that Abe Sada, still alive until that year, was the one maintaining the tribute to the man she loved most. The final alleged sighting of Abe Sada, however, occurred in 1992. According to a rumor, it was the infamous Japanese cannibal murderer Sagawa Issei who tracked her down, finding Abe Sada residing in a nursing home in Izu. There is nothing to disprove, but also nothing to definitively prove any of these theories. And obviously, even with Japan's insanely high life expectancy, we can safely assume that Abe Sada has passed away by now. I mean, she would be almost 120 years old as of the making of this video. But no matter how she spent her final years, one thing is for certain. The story of Abe Sada, her eventful yet tragic life story, her passionate yet unusual sex life, as well as her brutal yet grotesquely intriguing and unique crime against the man she claims to have loved the most, will undoubtedly continue to shock, disgust, and fascinate generations to come. But of course, one final question remains. One that I know has been lingering in the back of your minds for the past few minutes. Whatever happened to Ishida's severed manhood? Well, much like the woman that severed it from its host, it was lost and never found. By law, it would have belonged to Ishida Kichiso's rightful heir, whoever that might have been. But somewhat unsurprisingly, no one ever came forward to claim it. As a result, it remained in police custody until it was eventually transferred to the Pathology Museum at Tokyo University Medical School. Then, following the end of World War II, it was allegedly put on public display for a while. But at some point, it mysteriously vanished. Who knows, maybe Ishida's infamous Johnston is still floating in a jar of formaldehyde, buried in some forgotten basement in Tokyo, never to be seen again. But where do you think Ishida's thing ended up? What do you think ever happened to Abe Sada after her disappearance? Make sure to leave a comment down below if you feel like it. Do you support me on Patreon? Then here is a well-deserved shoutout to all of you, including Bavibu, Ronan, The Hockey Gentleman, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, Turam, Daniel Dees, RK0, Sierra DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yoko the Space Whale, Steve Matsui, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Herodine, Metal Mama, and T-Bird. And to everyone else who stayed around until the end, as always, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.